Thank you so much. So to place this issue in a little bit of context, in 2008, a previously simmering problem with maritime piracy off the Horn of Africa exploded rather suddenly to a very serious epidemic. And this was epitomized by the capture that fall of the Sirius Star, which was a supertanker, the first one to be hijacked by Somali pirates. And that really was a wake-up call to the international shipping industry, that one of the largest ships afloat, worth between hull and cargo approaching $250 million, could be seized with impunity and taken back to a lawless port on the Somali coast for ransom. As it happened, the pirates didn't have the technology to steal the oil cargo or a black market for oil large enough to fence that cargo, so they had to settle for a measly $3 million ransom. But still, even having that ship out of commission for the time that the ransom process was unfolding was an enormous cost. So the shipping industry saw this was no longer the sort of petty, low-level piracy, like coming on board and stealing watches and cell phones from the crew that had been taking place before. They knew that this was finally enough to justify an international security response. And several task forces were sent to the region, several navies were operating independently, and the warships there in and around the Gulf of Aden performed actually quite well when they could find the pirates. But the trouble was there's a mismatch between what the pirates are good at and what the navies are good at. The pirates had a large number of very cheap, very weak boats that threatened an area ultimately the size of Western Europe, whereas the warships were very powerful but very expensive and consequently limited in number. So the shipping industry knew that it needed something else to fill the gap between the security that the warships could provide and what they needed, because the warships were essentially just playing whack-a-mole, responding to distress calls all over this region. They couldn't turn the corner. Piracy kept going up, up, up from 2008 to 9, 10, and 11. And so that prompted the development of the private maritime security industry in that region. And at first that took the form of private escort vessels. So companies were buying surplus patrol boats from Scandinavian navies and elsewhere, outfitting them for private service, and then sailing them along in company with client vessels to protect them against pirates. And one of the chief reasons why they deployed in this manner was that most countries, most flag states at the start of this epidemic would not allow armed private security on board merchant ships. That fell afoul of firearms laws in most countries. But gradually, as the epidemic kept getting worse, key flag states like the UK and Norway loosened their firearms laws. They made exceptions so that, for example, in the UK, having a firearm on board a British tanker wouldn't be treated the same way as having a firearm in your home in Birmingham. So the law had to catch up over a course of several years. But finally then, by 2012, a majority of merchant ships operating in the high-risk area off the Horn of Africa did have some form of armed private security. And that had two key effects. The first was a deterrent effect, that the pirates who are in it for the money and have no desire to die in the course of their operations realized suddenly there was a very significant threat that if they attacked a ship defended by one of these private security companies, there was a good chance they would get killed in the engagement. So the pirates preferred to abort their attacks and wait for easy prey that was not guarded. But by the time a majority of ships had that protection, more and more pirate crews were returning without any hijacked ships. They were coming home in failure, and the business model began to collapse. The return on investment just wasn't there for the pirates' backers ashore. But the other key thing that private maritime security forces did was they allowed regular naval forces to be much more effective. Because then, instead of playing whack-a-mole, responding to distress calls, now that most ships had that protection, that allowed the warships to be much more proactive in seeking out pirates and interdicting their vessels and their motherships on the way to and from the Somali coast. So that also played a very significant role in suppressing piracy. So starting in late 2011 and running to the present day, we've seen that situation improve very dramatically. Just as Somali piracy was going down, though, we saw a spike in piracy off West Africa, in and around the Gulf of Guinea. But that was a different form of piracy from what we saw off Somalia. The Somalia model was hijack a ship, cargo, and crew all together, hold them in port for ransom for months or even over a year as the negotiations unfold. But the countries around the Gulf of Guinea, like Nigeria, had at least enough stability that pirates couldn't conduct business in that model. If they took a hijacked ship back to the coast in Nigeria, the local authorities could arrive, free the captives, and that would be the end of it. So the Nigerian, mainly Nigerian pirates in West Africa developed oil theft techniques that mirrored a lot of the oil theft that's going on land in Nigeria, which takes up, depending on who you ask, between 6 and 30% of Nigeria's daily output potential. So with these oil theft attacks, a small vessel will typically board a tanker fairly close to the coast and then hijack the tanker, link it up with a pirate-owned tanker, connect it by umbilical cables, essentially, and leach out several $1 million worth of oil, which is comparable to a ransom for a hijacked ship, and then fence that oil on Nigeria's thriving black market for oil, which is really the most sophisticated oil black market in the world. There's a key difference, though, between those two attack models, and that is, for the Somali pirates, the seafarers were part of their economic advantage. So keeping the seafarers safe had a payoff for them. It was bad for business to injure or kill the crews of the ships being hijacked by the Somali pirates. By contrast, the crews of tankers off West Africa are just in the way. The pirates are there just for the petroleum cargo. So we've seen those pirates be much more violent and aggressive, resulting in more danger to the seafarers there. Another difference, though, off West Africa is that the governments there have been fairly hostile to the presence of foreign private security contractors. They have not allowed them within their territorial waters, so we've seen really ungainly arrangements where a tanker will be escorted by private security forces from the UK or the United States up to Nigeria's 12-mile limit, and then they either part company with the escort vessel or lighter the embarked guards off, and then proceed into Nigerian waters, often accompanied by local paramilitary forces who cannot be overseen or vetted in nearly the same way that the Western private security industry can be. And those arrangements do a lot to line the pockets of local figures in West Africa. So that has cut off at the knees the incentive for the Nigerians and their neighbors to really get serious about the problem. I've seen at the highest levels of government, they seem to have their hearts in the right places, but the corruption that goes with this system is so far too serious for them to overcome. We're seeing now also that model of oil theft flaring up just in the last year in the Strait of Malacca in Southeast Asia, and that is a development that had not been foreseen by most analysts, myself included, because for the most part, the local navies in that region have been very good at suppressing piracy over the last half-decade. But even despite those efforts, we're seeing an increase in oil theft there. So now some of the private maritime security industry is pivoting in that direction as well. And that's a key result, really, because that demonstrates that in the face of changing economic conditions, changing threat profiles, and a rapidly evolving regulatory picture, this core of the industry, especially those firms that have their own private warships, essentially, which is the top tranche of the industry, that they have proven durable. And so I expect that we can project this industry continuing with a fair amount of stability for the foreseeable future. Finally, a different threat that I would like to flag to you this afternoon, that is something that is keeping a lot of people up at night in the shipping and maritime insurance industries, is the threat of renewed maritime terrorism around Africa, especially. In 2000, we had the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen, in which a suicide boat packed with explosives rammed an American warship and could have sunk it if not for the heroic action of the crew. A couple of years later, a French tanker called the Limburg suffered a similar attack. And at that time, in the early 2000s, maritime security analysts were thinking that was the threat, not piracy. But then piracy became more prominent, maritime terrorism faded. But we're seeing in the last several years a shift in the center of gravity of al-Qaeda and its allies from Afghanistan towards Africa, and now Iraq and Syria with ISIS. But the Africa threat has become more serious because al-Qaeda has affiliates both in Somalia, al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and several related groups in Nigeria. And they have expressed repeatedly and publicly their ambitions to sink merchant ships passing through those waters. They would love to get a tanker if they could pull that off operationally, or even a passenger ship. That would be a tremendous coup for them. And so I foresee, if we see a resurgence in maritime terrorism, really only one or two attacks, if they're serious, is all it would take, that would cause relatively much increased demand for private escort vessels as opposed to embarked guards, because with those terrorist boats, there's need not just to deter them like business-minded pirates, but actually to neutralize them at a distance from the client ships. So that's something that the industry is now looking toward apprehensively as a potential threat on the horizon as of today. So with that, I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I see hands up. All right, we'll come around.
Very interesting brief. Question in terms of what's been done in terms of nodal analysis. And one of the key things that's been done is when these pirates get the money, getting into the banking system. I know in some of the areas I've worked, that's been a key thing of where the money goes and putting pressure through those things, because if they get the ransom and can't do anything with it. Did you look at any of that? And then you referenced what happened on the Cole, and I was on with Admiral Gaiman after he retired when we did the investigation. One of the big problems we had was rules of engagement. We go back to what happened to bombing the Marine barracks, where the Marines didn't even have magazines in their weapons. Yeah, they had magazines in their weapons on board the Cole, but they were not allowed to fire until they got approval from an officer on the deck in the delay. The Navy has significantly changed the rules of engagement of how that's done. Do you see any of that thing happening in the civil sector right now, changing their rules of engagement of how they're going to handle approaching pirates?
Yes, I devote quite a bit of one chapter in my book to precisely that subject, rules for the use of force. And over the last 2 years, we've seen a collaborative effort by the shipping industry, maritime insurance industry, NGOs, and the private maritime security industry to formulate what they call the 100 series rules for the use of force, which do provide a clearer framework by which private contractors can use lethal force in encountering those threats. As to the question of ransom funding, the biggest problem there from the point of view of anti-piracy efforts is that a lot of the ransom money flows through the hawala system common in that part of the world, that is an informal banking network that is done on the basis of personal relationships and handshakes and passwords and couriers meeting face to face. And that's not something that the mechanisms of our Treasury Department are very well suited to handling. We can do a lot on the front of formal banking and big data and number crunching, but when it comes to two people meeting in a cafe 500 or 1,000 miles away from where the ransom was actually given, that's desperately hard to track, and I don't think we've been nearly as successful as we'd hoped to be.
Here you go. Right here.
All right, come down this way. Erin, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, I have a lot of questions, but the one I want to bring up, I understand in the Southeast Asia region, I got this information from reading an article around the UN. They have a division in the UN regarding maritime security, and it pursues terrorism and piracy. But now another dilemma has cropped up, and it is the matter of going after some of these ships, but they're not involved in either terrorism or piracy, but they're hauling an awful lot of drugs. So our ships that are out there, they end up confiscating the drugs, dumping it in water, and the men involved, they have to let go because they're not actually committing either of those two crimes, terrorism and piracy. And apparently the head of this branch in the UN regarding UN maritime security, whatever, was expressing an urgent need to have added to his charter that they can go after these drug smugglers, because we all know it's kind of funding terrorism and piracy. Could you expand on that, please?
Yes, well, we saw a fairly close analog to that in the first couple of years of the Somali piracy epidemic, wherein governments were reluctant to take on the burden of arresting and prosecuting pirates, because that is a very expensive and thankless job that lends itself to a free rider problem. In other words, if we in the United States prosecute pirates in Norfolk, Virginia, and imprison them at our own expense, all nations that sail the 7 seas benefit from that, but we bear the cost and the burdens. So over the course of several years, multilateral agreements emerged just by necessity for trying to share the costs on that front. But really the most notable instance of essentially what you're saying about catch and release was a policy by the Royal Navy, Britain's Royal Navy, at the start of this conflict, where they were actually under explicit orders from Whitehall not to formally arrest any pirates that fell into their hands, because the thinking was if they did so, they would be obligated to bring them back to the UK for prosecution. But then, due to human rights abuses going on in Somalia, the pirates could claim asylum and by UK law gain a path to citizenship. So they had this catch and release policy where they would take the weapons of the pirates and then give them a compass and food and fuel and send them back to the coast because there was nothing else they could do with them. Finally, amidst great international scorn, including from Secretary Clinton at the time, the government in Britain realized that that was a very poor policy to have, and they reversed it. But you're right that that has been a problem for the international community to sort out.
Right in the back there.
So leading on after your response to that, there's been some recent suggestions in Congress that we go back to the old constitutional system of letters of marque and reprisal, which sounds kind of fun to me, but I wanted to hear a more professional response. If you don't want to deal with all the bureaucracy and all that, just have people go out for hire.
Yes. Well, Ron Paul proposed that very idea in, I believe, the first year or so of the Somali conflict. And I devote part of a chapter in the book to why that is not an appropriate model here. But if I can condense that as much as possible, essentially that is relying on a misreading of the applicability of history to this conflict. Back when we issued letters of marque and reprisal to private actors, the thinking was they would use private warships and go out and capture merchant ships of foreign powers and then bring those merchant ships back to the United States. And the booty, or the cargo, from those merchant ships of belligerent powers that we were at war with could then pay for these letters of marque and reprisal. In this case, the pirate vessels are essentially worthless, on the order of a few hundred to a few $1,000s. Even their motherships are really nothing to cheer about. So there isn't a funding model there for letters of marque. But even more importantly, there's the concern that that would create perverse incentives wherein private security companies could be induced to be much too aggressive with suspected pirates and potentially go after innocent fishermen or other civilians in those waters. And their incentive would be to be as aggressive as possible and to twist whatever facts of an encounter may be to fit that narrative. Whereas what we're seeing right now is private security acting in a purely defensive function. And when they act in a defensive function, that's much easier for our courts to sort out because they see, for example, video of a pirate skiff approaching and shooting a rocket-propelled grenade right at the ship. That's a little bit clearer than you would have with private warships just going out and hunting for pirates with letters of marque. So those are the two main reasons, but I talk about a few more in the book.
Ben, I think you've got a question here.
Yeah, John Clark, I'm curious, in your view, how seriously is the tanker industry taking the insider threat? In the sense that there was a piece that ran in the Washington Times in September, and the first paragraph reads, U.S. intelligence agencies last month, August, reported that a group of 22 Yemeni Americans were training in Houston to be seamen on oil tankers, raising terrorism concerns over the unusual activity. DHS, I think, later released a report saying that database checks indicate there's no nefarious activity afoot, but nonetheless, they saw fit to circulate that same report to their intelligence units. So I don't know if your book addresses this or not, but what's your take on the tanker industry's ability to address possible threats from within?
My book does not address that. I looked at that concern a little bit, and from everyone I spoke to, that was not a concern within the shipping industry. Perhaps partly because there's not a whole lot they can do about it. The shipping industry is so international that there's really no plausible way of vetting crews from ship to ship and flag state to flag state, because you often see a ship that is owned by interests in the UK, operated by a company out of the United States, crewed by people from the Philippines and India and the Ukraine, and then flagged to the Marshall Islands. And with that tangle of different laws and jurisdictions, from a regulatory and vetting perspective to prevent insider attacks, that would be extraordinarily difficult.
Makes sense. Dan?
I'm just thinking it's a pity Christine Brim couldn't be here. She loves pirates, I think. So, first question, I have two if I can. Satellite surveillance, you talked that scenario, particularly the West Africa one. So they have this tanker, which has just taken on all this hijacked oil. we know exactly where it's gone. We have, if we want to pursue it, there's no hiding that tanker. So what's going on with that, and why is that not a liability for the pirates? We can see exactly where that oil proceeds to, and we know exactly where the theft took place. And the second question is about universal jurisdiction. As I understand it, it's been settled international law for some years that everyone has jurisdiction over pirates, and if countries would exercise it, they would literally be able to hold a trial at sea and put them up, hang them by the neck, by the yard arms, if they were willing to do so. It's a matter of national will, not the law. Isn't that right?
Turning to the second part of your question first, because that's a bit more conducive to a pithy answer. And the trouble is that's just human rights concerns. That since the days of the East India Company and branding pirates on the forehead and hanging them by the yardarm, our conceptions of human rights in the international community have evolved, and that just would not be considered acceptable. But you're right. In principle, universal jurisdiction allows any country to define piracy however it wants in terms of penalties and evidence, and some countries have been a bit harsher than others. There was an incident on a hijacked Russian vessel called the Moscow University in which it was alleged, though nothing was ever proven, that when Russian commandos stormed the ship, some of the pirates were left alive, and then afterward there weren't pirates left alive. And it's not really clear, but suspected that the Russians may have dealt with that in, yes. As to the question of satellite surveillance, I think the main issue there is that the United States doesn't have a task force in the region to do that. So we would have to rely on local actors. The Nigerians have not shown themselves ready to do that. And once the pirate tanker carrying the stolen fuel reaches the coast, they go into a labyrinth of small refineries and storage facilities in and around the Niger Delta, which is nearly impenetrable, very difficult to get at from a security perspective. And again, the black market for petroleum products in Nigeria, especially crude oil, is so sophisticated and so large that once the oil reaches the coast, there's really not much we can do about it.
Any more questions? Erin.
Yeah, just curious, since the Chinese seem to hang around a lot in the continent of Africa, are they in this in any way? Either enforcing, or are they a victim of it, or are they part of the illegality? Any thoughts?
They have had vessels in pirate-threatened waters on anti-piracy patrols, and they have had Chinese vessels using private security, including now some private security firms based in Asia. So they are involved in the industry, but I wouldn't say from the private security side itself, China has actually become a leader on that. Does that answer your question? Okay.
All right, over here.
Are the private maritime security companies, are they using any kind of technology as they protect ships, or is it mainly just having guys on the ships that are armed and having a vessel nearby that can respond? Are they using kind of imaging or sensors or?
Well, they often have off-the-shelf night vision, if you will, and the ships themselves have pretty good radar that can detect pirate vessels approaching, and in that case, it's not so much a matter of using the sensing technology itself to discriminate pirates from non-pirates, but the behavior of those contacts. So, for example, if a merchant ship sees on radar that two blips are approaching rather fast, they will think, okay, this may be a pirate attack. So then they will change their course. And if those two boats follow their course change, they know something is really suspicious, and then they can begin the process of putting out distress calls and then initiating the use of force procedures for any private security protecting them.